Hi, everybody. My name is Evan Radicic. I'm the Managing Director of the Cloud Software Association. Thanks a lot for joining us for another SaaS Connect. We've got Kabir Mathur from Typeform joining us to talk about a pretty incredible project that they did. Was it last year, I think, Kabir? Is it? Or a year and a half ago now?
Yeah, a couple of years ago is when we started, yes.
Nice. So it's a pretty, I think when we talk about integration, partnerships, and just kind of that whole building out an ecosystem of partners that plug into your product, it's a pretty hot topic all around, right? And depending on where you are in that stage of like, are you purely startup or you're kind of scaling, it's something that you're kind of looking into. And I think when we're kind of prepping for this interview, we're talking about the fact that there's a lot of companies that are, just kind of, scratching at it. That they'll build out the API, they'll kind of put it on the website, and they'll say, look, we've got this thing, you can play around with it, build, and go from there. And then they don't really approach you strategically. And then, there's no real kind of process to it. So, and then there's the other end of it where there's the whole staff and the whole strategy in it, and there's a lot in between. So, why don't you, I know there was a very specific project that you guys put together because you kind of looked at what was the status quo at Typeform at that time. You guys probably kind of looked at where you would like it to be, and then looked at kind of, ways you can get there, right? And this project really caught my eye because it's really something you can grab onto and kind of implement in your own organization. But it's just interesting, kind of the whole story. So why don't you we've got a whole bunch of questions we'll kind of go through to kind of uncover things and just have an open chat. But why don't you kind of give people just a high level overview of what this project was, like, what it was in the beginning when you guys were starting out, and what was the initial kind of ask for it, and then we'll kind of start uncovering. Sound good? Yeah,
absolutely. Happy to go into that, and thanks everyone for joining, whichever time zone you're in. Good morning, good afternoon. So diving right into it, the project specifically that Evan is referring to was actually structured in the form of a hackathon, and this happened back in 2018. In full disclosure, I wasn't at Typeform quite yet. I joined in 2019, so this happened a little bit before my time. But it was a really interesting way to kick off the integration strategy as a whole at a company. So the way it came about was the partnerships team at the time, in collaboration, of course, with a bunch of other departments, including product and engineering, decided that integrations was something really important to focus on as a company. So what they did was set up this cool project called Integrations Week. And it was really meant to be this all hands on deck kind of hackathon where 1 week was dedicated to building integrations that were identified as high priority. And the second week was dedicated to building marketing assets around them and actually getting the word out about these integrations and really laying the foundation for a true sort of integrations directory and integrations marketplace called Typeform Connect that we're also launching at the same time. So there was, of course, a lot of groundwork that went into this before Integrations Week kicked off. There was a lot of research done to look at what sort of integrations customers are asking for, what use cases Typeform is satisfying, how can we extend those, reaching out to partners, of course, to let them know that we're doing this exciting thing and getting their support from a co-marketing perspective, breaking up into teams, starting to ideate, and then, of course, going into these 2 weeks and being heads down and launching into it. And it was super successful and, of course, launched us onto this really exciting trajectory from there of building on top of it. It was a great foundation to build on top of.
Nice. So, I mean, was this something that you guys kind of set a separate budget and was like, okay, like we're gonna spend this, whether it's on marketing or resources or whatever the case is? Did you go specifically after like individual partners, say, look, we need, these are the core ones we need 100%, and you had to convince them to be kind of on top, like join the hackathon, or was it more organic? Like how did you pick those initial ones?
Yeah, good question. So it makes a little bit of sense to talk about the genesis of the project and why we did it. Typeform has been, and I think will always continue to be, a very, very customer-centric company. So first and foremost, this came from customer demand, right? It came from customer support tickets. It came from quantitative and qualitative research that we were doing, where customers were saying, hey, we need these sort of mission critical integrations from you guys so we can fulfill certain workflows. And they were very vocal. We're very lucky, I think, as a company to have a very vocal and dedicated and passionate audience. So we pay a lot of attention to those signals. That was a very strong one. And they called out certain partners by name, right? They called out they wanted an integration with Google Sheets, for example, with Slack, with HubSpot. These were some of the early integrations that we knew were really important that we needed to launch. Secondly, we had already established some connections with these other partners, and there was an eagerness from their side as well, of course, to work with us because we're a growing company, they were growing their bases, and they were probably hearing similar signals from their customers. So that was factor number 2. And I think the third was also understanding the role of Typeform within the larger MarTech ecosystem, right? We've been on this journey to become the default way to ask across the web, right? We're recognized in the market as this really friendly conversational way to ask for data. And the only way we can fulfill this vision of being wherever data is being collected is by putting tech partnerships at the center of this vision and making sure that we work with a bunch of other ecosystems in a very meaningful way. So those are the 3 factors that led to this project. And yeah, of course, in terms of the specific integrations that we wanted to work on, we're just listening to our customers as well as looking at the partnerships that we had already established to see which partners were engaged. And that's how we went about it initially.
Yeah, so I mean, you knew kind of, not necessarily the lowest hanging fruit, but the ones that would make the biggest impact from a customer point of view. Right? And
That's right.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Then, obviously just taking in every application for a party that comes in, it's more kind of strategic. But what about the API itself? Like, is it something that you guys kind of pre-built and it was like, look, this is these are the 10 paths, and this is really what we want to focus on. Did you get out of those? It was initial 7, right?
Yeah, it was 7.
You get a lot of back and forth. Like, was it kind of like, hey, we really envisioned it working like this, or was it very much like, we're gonna every single one of these is gonna build through these paths. We'll use that to kind of spearhead other things. But can you talk about a little bit about the quality of the API and kind of what the structure was for that? I mean, essentially a first launch, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were the groundwork had already been laid for the API. So we were in a fortunate position from an engineering perspective where our engineering team had taken not necessarily an API first approach, but recognized the importance of the API, both for customers to create their own sort of applications, but of course to enable us from a partnerships perspective as well. So we were in a pretty good place from that standpoint, having a relatively solid API. We've of course built a lot of functionality on top of it since, but we had a good version to start off with. All of the initial integrations that were built were sort of fulfilling similar jobs. So it was the concept of receiving a response in Typeform and then triggering an action in a third party. So for example, with Slack, sending a notification on a Slack channel of your choice. So the APIs enable those use cases really well. Of course, there was some back and forth with the partner to let them know what the use case was, more from a marketing standpoint than from an API or product perspective. But yeah, we're lucky in that sense where all of the use cases we had in mind could be enabled by the API initially.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting approach because, I mean, I know from personal experience, managing, these integration partners and building out for what would be, like the second iteration of the ecosystem, like kind of not the initial, like very much start, but like the kind of next version. And there was an enormous amount of challenges with that because it was like, okay, the API was at this level and it was really kind of like rudimentary kind of actions. And then the product became a little more complex. So now, what was the old functionality just didn't really serve the customers in the way they use the product now. So now it was like, okay, we need to rebuild the API and the ecosystem and the relationships and the partnership and start this all over again. So there's enormous amount of complexity that comes as the product evolves. But yeah, so I mean, what I'm interested in hearing more as we kind of unpack this is like what the specifics of the project was, right? Like, so we're talking about like, hey, let's get every department around the table, right? It's not just about partnerships or the product managing the relationship with the vendor and saying, hey, we got to build these components and, let's get them to market. Here's, in that classic kind of project management workflow around like launching a piece of product, right? Or something that plugs into the product. But when you get marketing and operations and, everybody around the table, I think everybody will agree that there's an enormous amount of challenge associated with that. And what I really liked about this project is that you call it a kind of hackathon, or it was the notion was like, look, this is a kind of closed project. It's got a timeline. It's almost like, let's all get in a room, like paint a picture, and then we'll walk out and we'll hang it on the wall. And it's like, it is what it is. It's done. Like if there's a deadline, and whatever ends up at that deadline, that's what it looks like. Which to me, it's like, it's a really easy thing to grasp when trying to sell something to different people that view it differently, right? So why don't you, can you just take us through kind of what that looked like? I know it's a loaded question, and I'm going to kind of unpack it as we go, but
sure.
When talking to marketing about this, like what is it? What were the expectations? What was the first kind of what was the first answer they gave you? What was the expectations? How was the experience working with marketing per se?
Yeah, so it really does take a village, right, to launch something like this, and I think marketing is a really big component of that. Especially because when you first launch an integration strategy, it's also a new path that you're creating for your customers. They're so focused on your core product, and that's what your marketing team, that's their muscle memory as well, is promoting that. So when you introduce a third element here in the form of a partner, it's a whole new dynamic. So luckily in this case, what the groundwork that had been laid was to of course, start with leadership and get leadership to buy in, and then get team leads to buy in as a component of that. And I think the hackathon, what it did was it kickstarted this motion of helping people understand within the organization what the ownership roles would be. And then marketing, of course, is a part of that. So like you said, it was finite in the sense that these projects had to be delivered within that period of time. With marketing specifically, they were building landing pages, they were building blog posts that would announce the features to our community. They were building social media campaigns. But what it also did was help them understand how this would work in a compartmentalized fashion when we started to repeat this process with partners in the future. So it was finite with a deadline, but it also had implications in terms of repeatability and scalability going forward. And I think that was really important, rather than simply trusting a single partner on marketing and saying, hey, here's this isolated project, work on it. They might work on it in that case, but creating that muscle memory of being able to repeat it wouldn't have happened, I think, in as easy of a fashion unless we went through this hackathon. So I think it was super successful in that sense. Yeah,
here's what I like about that. It kind of, every time I go through these things, I kind of try to bring it down to like human nature. It's like, you can get somebody to try something, they either hate it or they like it. Either way, they're going to go through the steps and the, like you said, muscle memory of, really like, what is it? How do I do this? They're going to go through the steps. They're going to do it. They know how to do it. So whether they like it in the end or not is another story, but at least they went through the motions. So by kind of packaging it into this like 2-week or 3-week or whatever it is into a project, you're saying, look, you're agreeing to work on, I don't know, X amount of campaigns, whatever that means to you or your product, but you're saying, look, you're gonna have to deliver. You're gonna have to actually, get your team around the table, look at these partners, look at the product, look at the integration, and come up with marketing tactics, strategy, campaigns to promote it or whatever the case is. So when that time ends and that launches, good, bad, ugly, doesn't matter. They've literally just gone through the entire process of, so to repeat that becomes way easier, right? Because they're like, well,
absolutely,
we already kind of went through, we did this. Now it's just a resource allocation. We don't have to figure out the workflow. We already know what it is. And I think that's really overlooked with this. It's like they probably didn't even think through that. It was just like, we're going to do this because we agreed to it. It's a project, but you're really teaching them how to work with your department, your partners, everybody else, within a company, within a very defined time frame, which to them is great because they don't there's no anxiety. I mean, there's other anxieties around, timelines, but there's no anxiety around I have to build this into my team long term, and I got to hire more, designers. I got to, none of that. All of that is out of the question. It's just 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I can do this. But you're secretly training them to provide support to you long term.
Totally. It's an organizational hack of sorts.
Yeah, it's an organizational hack. I love that you say it's a hackathon. Yeah. I'm like, man, that has so many meaning because it is a hackathon. It's 3 weeks, but it's also, you're kind of hacking into your own organization in a really nice way. But nonetheless, it's kind of, interesting. So that's great. So marketing got on board. Great. We had these, 7 launches. There was campaign, social, promotion, all that typical stuff that you would kind of see. So there was, let's say, 4 or 5 campaigns that were done. Is there how much learning was there during that process? Did you, was there kind of, is there anything that came out of it that was oh, we'll never do that again? Or anything that you would kind of pinpoint around them, kickstarting the marketing machine as it relates to this project, or something that you wouldn't do again?
I think there were just
words of wisdom, I guess.
There are probably, so again, I wasn't at the company at that time, but I think it was just understanding fundamentally what are these activities that we can do that will involve the partner as well, right? It's one thing to market to your own customer base, and taking a slight step back, I think when you launch an integration strategy, you need to also understand the objectives, right? And this is the first question that any good marketing person is going to ask: is what's the objective? And I think at Typeform, we've always viewed integrations as having potentially 3 fundamental impact points. One is on retention. The other is on expansion. So we're a SaaS product, so we have multiple plans. As someone adopts more integrations, we expect them to also expand and move up those plans. And of course, there's an acquisition aspect as well. So if you're in a marketplace that's larger than yours, there's this opportunity to be exposed to net new customers that you can pull in as leads and prospects. So I think there were some really key learnings there in terms of understanding what activities belong to which one of these different impact areas, right? So if you launch a blog post, that's most likely going to have an impact on the retention metric. But if you do a guest blog post swap with the likes of Slack, that gives you an opportunity to pull in a whole new customer base. So I think we went through these sort of fundamental learnings in terms of associating very tactical marketing initiatives to higher level goals. That's really the exercise that I think it accelerated again for us, is some of those learnings. And we've used a lot of those learnings over the years since then as well.
Nice. I'm trying to think, when kind of launching a project like this, there's obviously some failures that inevitably happen, right? You're kind of, hey, this just didn't work. Let's do this again. Is there anything that you would kind of implement that just come top of mind, right? That you would say, look, try to work with operations early on, focus on the marketing, try to work with product. Is there anything that kind of stands out that would be the real focus around the kind of the departmental part of it, working with a specific department?
So yeah, I think one aspect is from a tracking and data perspective. So Typeform is a really data-driven company, and I'm sure a lot of the folks on this call work for similar companies. That's one thing that I think we could have done better, is just think about these points of impact that I was just talking about. When you're trying to measure retention and the impact of a specific integration on customer retention, it's a pretty hard problem to solve when you get into it with a data scientist and try to isolate that impact versus all of the other product features that you have. So I think fundamentally, that's something that we could have done a little bit better, because then that also impacts the way you work with these different departments, right? It helps you prioritize the relationships that you should be paying more attention to. From a marketing perspective, for example, which of these partners, it doesn't matter so much maybe when you have 10 partners, but when you have 100, it's a much harder prioritization problem that you're trying to solve in terms of which of these partners should we work with to double down on and accelerate co-marketing initiatives and see more impact. And I think that's something that we didn't entirely overlook, but it's something we could have done a lot better early on to continually measure and then prioritize across different departments, ranging from marketing to even customer success, right? As we're introducing customers to not only our product, but to external workflows, which ones should we prioritize in that onboarding process? Because you have a finite amount of time with the customer. Typeform especially, a lot of our business is built on the back of a self-serve model. So as you're going through that automated onboarding journey, which of our partners should we be promoting to this customer so they realize the value not only from our product, but also by connecting it to an external ecosystem and potentially doubling the value that they're seeing.
Nice. I'm getting a question here. It's like, do you mind like just taking, and I think we actually did this yesterday, but taking actually just a company, one of those 7, and just kind of walking through what the process would have been, right? So if it is a Google Sheets or Slack, as detailed as possible, like, did you reach out to the partnership head at that company, build a relationship, hand it over to marketing, or like what was the, high level kind of like process to get to market in that 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks?
Yeah, so this is actually, it's very similar to the process that we follow today. So yeah, there was, of course, at a business development level, a relationship that was built with probably the head of partnerships or whoever on that side. And in parallel, there was probably some co-marketing discussions that were kicked off as well, right? To help their team understand what it was. In this case, we were building the integration. So there was no expectation necessarily from the partner to support us from a technical standpoint, other than maybe answering some questions about their API and giving us access to sandboxes and things like that. So those are part of the early conversations. And then you sort of pivot to, okay, this is what we're going to build. Do you have any advice? Are there other API endpoints that we should be looking at, or functionality within your product that we could leverage? And then that pivots to more of a marketing discussion. Once this is built, how do we get this out there? Here's what Typeform is going to be responsible for. Here's what Slack, for example, is going to be responsible for in terms of blog post promotion, social media mention, newsletter that might go out to a targeted audience that this integration is going to be relevant to. So yeah, some of these discussions were had prior to integrations week, but the follow through, of course, continued even after that sort of hackathon ended, because some of the activities were lined up for post-launch, for example. So yeah, that's sort of how we approached it initially.
So you kind of mentioned that, and there's a piece there that I guess a pretty big hurdle you guys didn't have to worry about early on, and that is that you guys are building the integration, right? And I think one of the biggest challenges, especially like early stage companies with not a lot of resources, run into is this like dance that you do with the partner to say, look, you want this, I want this, who's going to build it, who does what percentage wise, who's dedicating. And it's like, I think if it was some of those conversations, and especially like a lot of these partnership leaders are part of the CSA, they kind of already know each other. So they already have a relationship. So they can say, hey, in a very casual manner, say, look, hey, like we can't afford to do this. I want this because I see the value in this, and I see, I'm on the leadership team and I understand this is going to make an impact. However, I don't have the resources to put towards it. How can we do it? But it's not always that casual and clear cut. So you're kind of doing the dance of like feeling it out. Like, do they have budget? Do they not? So you've done this for a while, and I'm sure you've run into those instances.
Oh yeah.
What is your approach now? Like, I think it's like a 3-prong answer, because there's like the casual approach of you already know the person. There's the like, we're talking to a large much larger company than us. And then there's like equal footing, we don't know each other. In those three scenarios, what would be your approach to launching a pretty good poker hand and launching their integration successfully?
Yeah, this is a dance I do with partners almost on a daily basis. So yeah, very familiar with it. Let me talk about first this initial project that we launched. Right, that was very fundamental to us launching Typeform Connect, which is our public-facing integrations directory. So at that point, we had set aside resources to build because, and this is just general advice to anyone else that's going down this path. I don't think you can expect partners to build when your ecosystem isn't mature. It's a sign of commitment as a company, and you also have to stress test the process yourself, right? From an API perspective, app submission, testing the waters with these different departments internally in terms of handling the post-launch activities, support, and so on. So with those 7, it was very clear that we were going to be the ones that build. And also some of those partners were much, much larger than us at that point. So Google was never going to build for us, and same with Slack. So the dynamic was quite obvious back then. And yeah, in terms of the 3-pronged answer, I think the second arm it's pretty obvious, right? When the company is significantly larger than you, if you're talking to a sales force, there's only one way that conversation is going to go. So there's really no leverage. Yeah, you're building, deal with it. Set aside the resources. If you don't have the resources internally, there are a whole bunch of external vendors, system integrators that you can look into, some that even specialize in specific ecosystems like Salesforce. So that would be my advice, is to look into those types of partners if you need them. If it's a casual conversation, I think it's, in that case, it's good to be transparent, right? Share what your roadmap looks like, share what your priorities are, share what your research shows as well, because it might, in most cases, what's going to end up happening is there's a more urgent need from one side or the other. You both might be looking at similar customer data, but there might be a better alignment with either a marketing project or overall overarching product objective within your organization. That dovetails nicely with an integration with whatever partner you're speaking to. So based on who has that greater sense of urgency and of course, resource availability, I would say you kind of take the approach. And also, what I'll also say about this is it's a give and take, right? So if one partner is agreeing to build, then typically the other partner should agree to maybe invest more from a marketing standpoint. So that's how I would treat that sort of scenario.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's not about. I mean, there's 2 things, right? There's a resource allocation nonetheless. Like whether you're building it or they're building it, you need to have the budget associated. Like you can compare it to like a travel budget. You have a travel budget. There's only so many events you can go to. You got to choose the best ones for what you're trying to accomplish. Integration, exactly the same thing. It's like I've got a budget. As many, as well as I can negotiate this, that just means I can build more of them, right? So it's not necessarily you can't do it. It's just, if I can get more bang from the buck, I'll just be able to stay an extra day, or build an extra integration. So I think it's, going into it and say, look, this is going to cost us something. It's never going to be that like, because if they're doing all of it, it's, you kind of almost don't want it, right? Like there has to be a shared ownership there, because it's more than, it's same as like selling somebody something. It's, there needs to be some components win-win, right? So if one party's picking up the bill for the whole thing, it's skewed, right? So yeah, like marketing is actually a great way. It's like you never think like, well, yeah, if you guys build this out, I have way more flexibility on the marketing side because it fits our objectives, right? Like we have more budget in marketing this year because this or that, right? So let me do that. And they might say, oh, great, because like we're actually, it's really hard for us to get marketing money because of whatever. So it's about being, like you said, like being transparent and just being like, look, we want this, you want this, great. Like let's let's financially look at how we want to do this. Like we've got some stuff to play with. Like it's not just about engineering time, right? But you're still kind of doing the dance there, though. Even though when you gave me that answer, you were still kind of like pulling back a little bit. Like it's such a such an interesting thing, right? Like when negotiating these things, it's you can't. Yeah, it's anyway. But
there's no definitive answer. You know, I mean, I think a good rule of thumb is the bigger organization generally takes a step back from a development standpoint. But we've even had that experience where that doesn't always hold true. There's either, maybe in some cases, there's been kind of an urgent need from our side. There's also, with all of these new ecosystems popping up, there are a ton of first to market opportunities where you have these partners that are launching app stores for the first time. They're launching app directories, and there's a big marketing push happening around that. And Typeform as a company, we're very open to being one of those first partners because it has all of these residual effects of one, establishing a really strong partnership with this company because you're going to give them a lot of feedback on their API, and you're also going to be one of the first few apps that's promoted in a big way, in a very not non-noisy environment to a set of customers that's very engaged, right? So in that dynamic, if the company is smaller than you, it's okay because the benefits potentially outweigh the cost that's going to go into it from a development perspective. So I think it really depends on the scenario, but we try to use the general rule of thumb of, if we're the bigger company, we typically will take a step back and expect the other company to build because we have to play the same role when we're talking to these much larger ecosystems.
Yeah, and I mean, even with that, and I think the question here is around, what that onboarding is. Like, even if it's, you're building it out or they're building, it doesn't really matter. You're the one that knows your API. You know the product the best, right? So what does that package look like? I mean, I'm assuming even if say they're building 100% of it, you're still going to have to go through checkpoints, make sure that it's not going to break anything. And what does that kind of onboarding, guidance, and launch look like? I mean, is every single point, standardized, fill this in, connect this, John's going to look at this. If you pass that, then, Lindsay's going to look at this, and or is it kind of like, here's the package, when you're done, call us when it's done? Like, what does the deployment look like, and how much, I don't want to say training, but how much of that kind of walkthrough do you guys do with the integration part, like partners then and even now?
It's somewhere in between the two scenarios that you described, but I think we've gotten it to a point where it's a pretty well-defined process. Internally, the different departments that are involved in this process know their role, but it's also not as involved of a process as, let's say, submitting an app to Salesforce, right? That's a very, you have to go through a security review. You have to jump through a ton of hoops, frankly speaking. I mean, having gone through the experience, I'm very familiar with it. We try to keep it as lightweight and easy for the partner as possible, but it is still a defined process. So we have our developer documentation. One party reaches out, right? We have a process where if someone's interested in building with Typeform, they fill out a form, and a Typeform, of course, declare their interest, talk about the use case. We set up a call, just figure out if there is actually a fit. And if there is, we set up another more technical call where we dive into the APIs. We do a little bit of product architecture to figure out, okay, these are the endpoints you're going to use. This is what the UI might look like from a customer's perspective. These are the use cases it'll fulfill. And then we just have them build the integration. Of course, we're available from a technical support standpoint. There's a developer advocate that manages a ton of relationships with such partners of ours. And then they submit the app to be listed. We do some basic testing on it, but again, there's no heavy lifting done on our side in terms of doing a thorough review like some of the larger ecosystems do. And then, there's some things we have to do on our side. We list it in our marketplace. We have a community that we've recently launched that's very active, so we announce it there. We let our customer success team know that this is happening. So if support tickets start to come through, the responsibilities are very clear in terms of who owns support. and so on. So there's a few other processes like this that are quite well defined at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you describe a pretty well-oiled machine there, right? I've been in the other end of that, where none of that is defined, and you're literally just trying to like, okay, like we're going to work with this partner. What does that mean? Like, how are we tracking this? Like, how are we monetizing it? How are we tracking what, you're really trying to create everything, that instance from scratch. And then, but the thing is, it's both starting like, small and just, working through it, right? I think what you're describing there in terms of like, letting CS know, hey, this is going to be coming through. So when they start complaining about this integration, here's the path you're following, and here's your point of contact on their end to troubleshoot. Like, those are complicated things to put in place, right? Especially right at launch. I can't imagine. Like, did you guys have that in place on those first 7?
Oh, no, definitely not. It was much more informal, and this has been a journey, and these steps have evolved over time. You need to have dedicated resources allocated to owning these processes internally, and that's happened. That's been an evolution for sure.
Yeah. So what were the I guess wow moments between those 7 and whatever 50 plus that you guys have now that really justified scaling that team and the resources and the attention to that ecosystem build? Like, what were those? I mean, what were the expectations at the end of that sprint? Like, what did you guys want to have? Is it just like 7 launched and functioning and nobody complaining about them, or was it revenue facing? And then second question is like, what is that like biggest, I guess, 1 or 2 successes that you had that leadership said, okay, like this is the real deal. Let's put some real resources into this, start scaling this big. Is there anything that really jumps out that, whether the CEO was like, oh my God, this is it, or was it on a team level that people are like, okay, like we're really seeing success in these actions? What were those indicators that really pointed to like, let's double down on this, let's develop it?
Sure. So with the initial hackathon project, it was to get these 7 out because we knew they were high priority. To launch Typeform Connect, so sending a message out to the world, basically saying we're open for business. Here's our API. Here's our integrations marketplace. Let's talk and let's scale this together, right? So with that, actually, that was tied to a company level OKR, where there was a recognition that integrations were important. So we wanted to increase I think there were 3 objectives. One was to increase the adoption of integrations overall across our monthly active base. 2 was to have a certain percentage of customers adopt integrations in their first 30 days as customers. And the third was to, of course, promote a set number of third-party developers to build on top of our APIs in the first, I think, 3-4 months after launch. So those are very specific objectives that we were going after at the outset. Of course, since then we've scaled to, it's actually over 100 partners at this point that we have. So that was the outset. In terms of key indicators, there's actually an interesting slide that I can share. This was actually, I mean, it's of course been adopted. I'm not sharing real numbers in terms of the specific MRRs and LTVs and so on. But this is a trend that we started to see very quickly once we had, a handful of partners. We started to see a very, very strong correlation between the number of integrations adopted by a customer and MRR, the number of paying months that they were staying on with us as a customer, and ultimately LTV as well. So you see between 0 and 1, there's not a huge uplift, but when you get into that 3, 4, 5 plus integrations adopted, it started to get really, really interesting, right? And this is something that we continue to monitor, and this is something that made it very obvious to us that we should continue investing in this initiative and allocating a ton of resources to it and making it really central to our expansion plans as a company.
I mean, that's almost a 40% like bump from 2 to over 5 on the retention. I mean, that is significant. Like, I'm assuming you guys were tracked. So can you touch on how you guys were actually tracking this? Like, is it Salesforce? Is it like, was the tech stack look like to get numbers like this functioning?
Yeah, so we use Stripe as our billing layer, so it's very easy, of course, to figure out on a customer by customer basis how long they've been a customer. That also gives us the MRR because like I said, we have a variety of different plans. There's upgrades, downgrades, but you normalize for all of that. So yeah, it was primarily just that, and using analytical tools like Looker to create dashboards. So something like this was measurable over time. We probably pulled in other product analytics using Segment and a few other analytics tools like that. But yeah, this is something from a data science perspective that we've been tracking for quite a while now.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, even if you look at it just simply, is that if you're trying to deliver on a specific objective as a business, right? And you've got 5, 6, 7 tools that are working in harmony towards delivering on that objective. You generally don't try to break it, right? Like unless there's something really wrong with it, you're once it's built, you're in it for the long haul, right? So the retention becomes quite important, obviously. But if you're just using it as a standalone tool, it's pretty easy to switch, right? So being plugged into several tools just makes you just that much stickier, right? Which, I mean, it makes sense, right? But to provide to have that conversation just without any numbers with the leadership team is one thing, because then it's how well can you sell this dream, and versus like showing them numbers to say, look, we did a 6-week hackathon. We built 7 integrations, and in the last 4 months, accounts that were using these integrations, the churn has reduced by 20%, whatever. That is a much different conversation. And then we say, I need a staff of 3 so we can do 10 more integrations. It becomes a much easier decision, right? So it's about starting small, tracking the hell out of it, and then building out an ask based on data that you see that actually happened, right? And then if it's not good data, it's good for you too. Like you're like, okay, like that didn't work. I'm gonna do something else now, right? Like you're not gonna waste my time with it. Either way, you're gonna win. Like even with the failure, you're kind of winning because you're saving time.
Yeah, totally. Go and do it with a spirit of experimentation and be inquisitive, because it could be that the integrations that you build or that the partners built aren't necessarily aligned with the use cases of your customers. That's still a learning. You can pivot. There's a ton of companies out there that you could potentially work with.
Yeah, totally. I got a question here from the audience. Any lessons learned on which partners are fit? The partners who deliver are not always the ones that you expect in the beginning. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. You're like, oh, I need to be, this partner needs to come on board because they're just going to be a game changer, they're going to bring all these customers. And then, the one that you barely even got into the program provides more value than the first one. So like any kind of curveballs like that you saw, they were like, because I mean, obviously there's a break in the formula if there is, and how do you approach it?
Yeah, so I think with the first 7 partners, we probably saw some disparities then, right? We prioritized them because there were very clear signals from our customers that they wanted these integrations. But over time, you can see that some of those have tapered off. There were, for example, like file uploads and file management was really big. And that could have been just a side effect of how hot Dropbox and Box were as companies back then, around 2018. But those use cases over time sort of tapered off versus some of the CRMs like HubSpot that we prioritize, or Slack as a notification and communications tool. We went into it with assumptions that maybe all the partners would perform in a similar way, because in terms of total addressable market, they were all pretty similar. But yeah, some of those tapered off. So over time, it's the lesson learned there is that continue to listen to your customers, continue to do research, and understand what those use case extensions look like, which partners to involve, and yeah, keep continually test the hypothesis, right? Launch with different partners, and then only engage the ones, of course, that prove themselves out and continue to show results over time.
Right. mean, that kind of brings me to another one. Another question here is that you say you guys have 100 plus integration partners, and that's, since early 2018. Like you said yourself, like what was hot then is not so much now. How are you kind of revisiting these relationships? Is it one-on-one? Is it like, what's your approach on, like, once you get over that, like you have 20, when you have 20 integration partners, like you can manage those relationships. Once you get into 50 plus, 70, 80, 100, it becomes more difficult. What's your approach on like taking the heartbeat of the relevancy of the integration at this point for somebody that built it out, say 2019, 2018?
Yeah, this is why I defer to data again, right? Again, Typeform has a very, very data-centric approach. We're lucky enough to have good data resources. So we have dashboards that monitor a lot of this. We at this point, what we do is we split up the integration launch phase into really two phases. So there's the first phase where we list a partner once they've expressed interest in working with us. We announce them to our community. We do a couple of base level activities that are not very resource intensive for us. This helps seed the integration. And then we wait and see what the adoption looks like. Is there adoption? What types of customers are using this integration? Are they enterprise grade customers? Are they self-serve customers? What jobs are they trying to complete? And then these retention metrics and all of that as well, right? We look at all of that. And then we decide whether or not to invest in phase two. And phase two typically involves a heavier lift co-marketing activity or series of co-marketing activities. With many of our top integration partners, we invest in co-marketing almost on a quarterly basis. So yeah, that's really how we approach it, is to rely on the data. And also, of course, rely to some extent on the partner to engage us when there's something worth engaging on. Yeah,
that makes sense. I've got a question here from Andrew Sugar. This is kind of interesting. That I actually was going to ask almost this exact question. Do you list any third-party apps like Zapier integrations, or do you only list on the directory itself, or do you only list the native apps? Because like there's this huge movement now, like you start seeing like this huge like list, and you're like, oh my God, these guys have like 150 integration partners, and then you look at closely and you're like, well, 90% of those there's apps, which is fine. It's just, it's not the same thing, right? So how's your approach on that? Like, do you guys list them all, or?
Yeah, we do. We actually give them their own sort of real estate within our app directory. Zapier is a great partner of ours. We, again, in terms of context, and maybe this is somewhat specific to Typeform, we have a customer base that now is in the six figures, and we really, as a product, satisfy a bunch of different use cases. There is only so many that we can focus on from a partner perspective. And those are the ones that are top of mind for us. Those are integrations that either we're building or we're encouraging partners from within certain segments. For example, lead generation, lead qualification, those are huge use cases for us. So any ecosystems that match well with that objective, we are always open to exploring. But like in the case of Zapier, I think they now connect with a few thousand different tools, right? So for the long tail, I think it makes a lot of sense. And also it enables some of the niche use cases to be explored by customers, even within the ecosystems that we might have native integrations for. So we absolutely see the value in that, and we're very happy to support it. Not to mention Zapier is a great source of leads for us. They continually send customers our way.
Yeah, and it kind of, I don't know if you meant to mention that, but like, if you do have that unique like niche, we need this software that not a lot of people use to do this thing, and you're like, well, nobody's going to build that natively. Yeah. However, if we can accomplish, 75% what you want through a few apps, let's start with that, and then make that available in the ecosystem. If people start using it, now we're like, oh well, there's a trend. Like maybe we should put some. So it's almost like a low lift test that solves a problem for one or two companies, maybe more, right?
Totally.
but it doesn't require an enormous amount of commitment. So it's interesting. The second part of Andrew's question was actually, do you use any you touched on it a little bit, like do you use any third-party integrations like Betray.io, to build some of these integrations? And what's your approach on that? Like, because some of them, you're passing on the cost to the customer to build it out, and there's a recurring model, recurring structure, cost structure associated with using that integration that's outside of your control, kind of. Like, what's your thought on using those outside vendors to kind of build those integrations?
So we actually do use Betray.io. We're a customer of their embedded product. Yeah. So when I joined the company in 2019, and going back to your question about doing this dance with partners and understanding who should build, the problem that we were staring at that was very apparent was, we had this great ecosystem that was starting to scale up. We were attracting partners to build, but we were also up against a pretty significant list of integrations that our customers wanted us to support. And the partners weren't necessarily committing at the rate that we wanted, right? Like, we wanted these integrations yesterday. And the sort of horizon that we were looking at was maybe in 12 months, we'll have 10 of these when there are 30 requests that we need to fulfill. So we made a pretty strategic decision at that point to accelerate our pace of building integrations in-house by using Betray.io. So we adopted the product, and within 6 months, we built 15 integrations using Betray.io. So the output was massive, and these were high priority integrations that we knew there were very strong customer signals associated with them. And the partners, of course, were very happy to support us from a marketing perspective. So yes, I'm a big believer in that. It's not an ideal experience from a UX standpoint because there's only so much customization that you can do. But in terms of, I take the approach of, is it better to have nothing rather than something? And Betray.io, I think, helps you get to market very, very quickly with a base level of integration that can satisfy your customer requirements.
Nice. No, yeah, I agree. It's like it depends on where you are in the game, right? Like, do you have a staff of 10 or 15 developers that are dedicated towards building integrations, and you have marketing support and all this stuff, or are you in the most likely scenario where you're understaffed, under budget, with a 30 integration launch for the year ask?
Yep.
You kind of have to make a decision based on what you got, right? And again, like it's always the 75. It's like, yeah, I know you want this. Can we do 75% of that? Can you live with 75%? And most people can live with 75%.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Including the customers. Again, like, you're not going to have the flashy colors and the fireworks, but is it going to get you from point A to point B? Yes. And then, it's always easier to kind of level things up than to, start from scratch, right? All right, so we only got a few minutes left. I kind of had just one last question. You guys, like you said, you started off with the 7, proved it out. You went to 50, you proved it out even more. There's data there now. There's resources that are being allocated. You guys are growing into 100 plus. You're building this ecosystem. There's an enormous amount of traction that and building has been happening over the last year and a half. Looking at where things are, and especially in SaaS, like how fast it's growing and accelerating, and like you said yourself, everybody's building an ecosystem. So there's multiple ecosystems. There's huge players. There's an enormous amount of entry into the market. People starting out. Like, where do you guys? Where do you see the future of the Typeform integration ecosystem? Where do you see it going? Where would you like to see it next year? Like, just kind of open-ended question, just to see what's your vision for this thing?
Sure. So I'll answer that in 2 parts. I think it's at least a 2-pronged strategy. One prong involves us continuing to build for other ecosystems that we see value in, right? For example, just a few weeks ago, we were one of the launch partners for Notion's API. They launched our API. We knew that this was an integration that was going to be adopted very significantly because Notion and Typeform are very often mentioned as part of a no-code stack together. And sure enough, that proved itself out. So we want to be open to these sort of first-to-market opportunities within partner ecosystems that make a lot of sense. We're constantly referring back to customer signals through quantitative and qualitative research to validate that these opportunities make sense with our overall product vision. So we are very much going to continue forging down that path and set the resources aside to do that. And the second is potentially changing the nature of how we engage with partners within our own ecosystem. So today, what our APIs enable is really, it's somewhat limited in that we're just working with partners for the most part in a data sync manner, right? So data is flowing from Typeform to an external partner or vice versa in some cases. And the level of involvement is, and what you can build is somewhat limited. What we're working on, without revealing too much, is creating more of a concept of apps that live within Typeform. So not only through this vision, not only do we want to attract a whole new set of developers and partners that we don't work with today, but we also want to re-engage our current partners to see, will this new framework that we're building enable them to build something new that offers net new functionality to both Typeform's customers as well as to their own. So that's really where the evolution is going. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have a little bit more that we can discuss and share around this. But there's a lot of work happening on our end on that front.
Nice, awesome. Yeah, no, I think it's an evolving thing, right? It's like you said, what was relevant. I mean, it's kind of crazy to even think like, what 2-3 years ago, what you were doing and what everybody was doing and what's going to be happening next year and the year after. But it needless to say, you kind of have to be ready for the evolvement, right? So all right. So thanks so much for agreeing to kind of jump on, and thanks everybody for joining us. For those of you that joined us live, and for the ones that are downloading this on Spotify and Apple and all that stuff. So thanks for joining us. You're part of the CSA community, and if there's anybody that has any questions around this session in particular, or kind of the integration marketplace, just join us on Slack. More than happy to answer questions. But yeah, thanks for joining us. Kabir, thanks a lot for being part of this, and yeah, have a good rest of your day, guys.
Thanks a lot, Evan. Thanks for having me.